He served with the Marines in Vietnam, was in the Marine Reserve. He was a senior Fulbright scholar in India. He has been historian at the U.S. Army Center for Military History. He has taught at Princeton University and the University of Alabama. He is currently professor of history and international relations at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. He has been professor of strategy at the National War College in Washington. He was a professor at Kyoto University in Japan. His books, there are more than a half dozen of them. They include After Tet, The Bloodiest Battle in Vietnam, History of the U.S. Army in Vietnam, a biography of Admiral George Dewey, the book that I just mentioned earlier, Eagle Against the Sun, and his new book, which he's going to be talking about this evening, called In the Ruins of Empire, The Japanese Surrender and the Battle for Postwar Asia. We are delighted to have this most distinguished American military historian with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ronald Spector.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Do we have any former Marines in the audience? Okay. Well, I thought that there would be some veterans in the audience, so I wanted to start off with an amusing story of some kind, but I had a great deal of trouble finding a Marine joke that was suitable for a mixed audience, and that required almost as much research as the book did. But I found one, and you may not know that recently the Prime Minister of Chile visited Washington, and he brought along 12 penguins as a gift for the president. Well, the Prime Minister left, and the penguins were still at large in the White House. And finally, the Chief of Staff called in the gunnery sergeant of the Marine Guard, and he said, "Gunny, you got to do something about these penguins. They're running all over the place. People are mistaking them for members of the National Security Council. We have to, got to get them out of the White House." And so the gunny said, "Aye, aye, sir," and picked out a Marine, and he said, "Corporal Yumyuts, check out a truck from the motor pool and get rid of those penguins." And so the Marine said, "Well, what should I do with them?" He said, "Well, take them to the zoo." So the Marine loaded up the penguins and put them in the truck, drove away. The next morning, the gunny was astounded to see the truck parked across from the White House, and the penguins are still there, and each of them has a towel wrapped around his neck and is wearing sunglasses. So the gunny comes out and he says, "Yumyuts, I thought I told you to take those penguins to the zoo." And the corporal said, "I did, and today we're going to the beach." So that's one clean joke in my repertoire. I guess when you are off promoting your own book, it's customary to say something about how you came to write the book. And in my case, when I was in Japan in 1998, teaching at Ritsumeikan University, and then in 2000 teaching at Keio University, I saw a number of accounts, mostly reminiscences about Japanese who had stayed on after the war was over in China, Indochina, Indonesia, and there were even kind of alumni associations of people who had been in these countries following the war. Sometimes they were there for years. In the case of China, there were thousands of them, and the last ones didn't come home till about 48 or 49. So it occurred to me that, excuse me, there might be a kind of sequel here to Eagle Against the Sun, because almost nobody had written about what had happened to Japan's empire as opposed to what happened to Japan after the war. Nobody had talked about the rest of Asia after the war. And originally I was going to call this Son of Eagle Against the Sun, but decided against it. So far as Americans are concerned, the war ended on August 14th, 1945, when Japan surrendered unconditionally. The finality of this action seemed appropriately commemorated in the solemn and impressive ceremony on board the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2nd. This was the end of the war, as portrayed in hundreds of American history textbooks, usually with a photo of the Japanese representatives in their frock coats and top hats, signing the instruments of surrender under the watchful eyes of General Douglas MacArthur in the shadow of the Missouri's massive 16-inch guns. After that, the Japanese, under American guidance, gave up their bad habits, acquired a new democratic constitution, signed an American-brokered peace treaty in 1951, and entered into a series of security arrangements with the United States. And so Japan was not much of a problem to the U.S. until their automobiles and televisions began to edge out their American competitors. Yet the end of the Pacific War involved not simply the occupation of Japan, but the military occupation of a vast area of Asia, stretching from Burma to the borders of Siberia. The war had been won in the Pacific, and most of the fighting had been done in the Pacific. In Asia, Japan's empire was largely intact. Japanese armies had been defeated in Burma, but not in Malaya or Vietnam or Indonesia or Korea. All of these areas were still under Japanese control. At the moment of surrender, there were approximately 6.5 million Japanese soldiers and civilians, about 1 in every 20 Japanese, in the Pacific or on the mainland of Asia. They included 1,200,000 in Manchuria, 750,000 in Korea, and 1.5 million in China, as well as 700,000 in various parts of Southeast Asia. Now, the occupation of this vast area involved hundreds of thousands of British, Indian, Soviet, and U.S. troops, most of them veterans of recent combat in Europe or the Pacific or Burma, and none was very eager to become occupiers or peacekeepers. So this is really a story about military occupations in 5 of the countries of Japan's former empire: Malaysia, or what is now Malaysia, Indonesia, China, Korea, and Indochina. While I was writing the book during 2003 to 2005, military occupations became a hot topic for obvious reasons. You may remember that proponents of the war in Iraq talked about the success of American occupations in Japan and Germany as an indication that things in Iraq would go swimmingly, and we had this precedent to base our expectations on. And of course, they forgot about the other occupations that I described here. But then when things began to go bad, more and more people began to talk about military occupations in terms of what we should have learned, lessons, recommendations by social scientists, talk show hosts, politicians, and they came up with all kinds of rules of success that apparently nobody had thought of before the beginning of the Iraq War. Some said that success required lengthy occupations. Others said that success required short occupations because long ones aroused the opposition of the local people who were being occupied. Some said totalitarian governments would have to be reformed from the bottom up. Other people said totalitarian governments need to be reformed from the top down. Too few troops in the occupation force could be bad. Too many would get on the nerves of the locals. So I want to point out that the answers to these questions can all be found in my book, except that, as you will see, on all of these generalizations, the story of the Japanese Empire's liquidation casts a bright light of ambiguity. The success and failures in East Asia and Southeast Asia in 1945-46 were often the result of factors that were far beyond the power of generals and soldiers to halt or redirect. Of course, success and failure are relative terms. Were these occupations amid the ruins of the Japanese and European colonial empires successes or not? Well, successful for whom? In what way? If we look at this as an operation to liquidate the Japanese empire, the Allied occupations succeeded brilliantly. Japanese forces throughout Asia surrendered in an orderly fashion, were disarmed, and were sent home. There were no stay-behind guerrillas or underground networks of die-hard Japanese. Yet many of the occupations fell somewhat short of the avowed objective of liberating Asia from the Japanese. In China and Southeast Asia, the Allies employed thousands of Japanese soldiers and civilians as technicians, advisors, guards, auxiliaries, police, and sometimes combat troops against the local inhabitants they had come to liberate. A far smaller proportion of Japanese also threw in their lot with Southeast Asian nationalists and played an important, perhaps critical role in training, advising, and sometimes leading the anti-colonial forces. Viewed as an effort to establish peace and stability on the ruins of Japan's Greater East Empire, the occupations were a resounding failure. If Asia in 1945 was an enormous boiling pot, as General Wedemeyer had observed at the end of the war, then the Allies did little to prevent the pot from boiling over. By 1948, all of the states occupied by the Americans, British, and Russians were at war, either with their former colonial rulers or with political factions within their own country, sometimes both. Some of these wars were concluded in 1949, some continued into the 1950s, one was not settled until 1975, and two of them are still going on in China and Taiwan and North and South Korea. So if success is hard to define and to measure, it is easier to say what made things at least go most smoothly for the occupiers so that they did not find themselves targets or have to put down an insurgency. And we can see some of the reasons for these relatively easy occupations as well as the bad ones. If we look at just three examples that I will talk about briefly, the U.S. Marines in China, the U.S. Army in Korea, and the Australians in the extreme eastern part of Indonesia, what is now Malaysia and Indonesia on the island of Borneo. The Marines' mission in North China at the end of the war was to assist the Chinese nationalists in reoccupying key areas in the north and to supervise the disarmament and the evacuation of the Japanese army from China. While the presence of the Marines would have the practical effect of denying the cities and railroads in the north to the Chinese communists, the U.S. theater commander, General Albert C. Wedemeyer, was instructed by Washington that American forces should avoid involvement in China's civil war. On Guam and Okinawa, men of the 1st Marine Division speculated incessantly about when they were going to go home to the U.S. All Marines were aware that under the newly instituted point system based on time overseas, many of them would have first priority returning home. On Guam, however, General Keller E. Rocky's 3rd Marine Amphibious Corps headquarters was monitoring the message traffic between Wedemeyer, Admiral Nimitz, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It was soon apparent that China, and not the U.S., was the likely destination for most of Rocky's Marines. Well, like most big secrets in the Marine Corps, this one was almost immediately known to thousands of Marines by the time the 3rd Amphibious Corps received its warning order on August 22nd. What a bummer, recorded Sergeant Edward Earle. Some of the men were really bummed about the prospect of not going home and started to report to sickbay with battle fatigue. Earle's company commander called his sergeants together. The first thing he did was to give the order that he would court-martial any man reporting to sickbay with combat fatigue. We passed the word and there were no more combat fatigues. We were not happy, recalled Corporal Calvin Decker, but Marines are trained to take their duty as it comes. Along with disappointment, there was more than a little enthusiasm. China was an exotic land that few ordinary Americans could ever hope to visit. The very word China was almost a synonym in American slang for distance and remoteness. I'm sure many of you remember there used to be a popular song in the 1940s in which a man tells his sweetheart, "I'd like to get you on a slow boat to China." Marines had a long association with China stretching back to the first years of the 20th century. China duty with the legation guard in Beiping and Tianjin, or with the 4th Marines in Shanghai, was the most glamorous, most desirable, and most prestigious assignment in the old Corps. Platoon Sergeant George H. Hurtland remembered feeling great about going. When I enlisted in June 1941, I hoped that someday I would go to China. Of the 8 generals assigned to 3rd Amphibious Corps, 7 had served pre-war tours in China. In both Marine divisions, officers and enlisted men who had spent time in China before the war passed on their colorful tales of life in the Orient to younger Marines. I decided I was going to enjoy the trip to China, recalled Sergeant Earle. I asked myself, when would I ever get to see China again? I think after the fact that all of the men were glad to have had the opportunity. On September 26, landing craft carrying the 1st Battalion of Marines crossed the Taco Bar at the mouth of the Heiho River, headed for the town of Tangkou, where Marines boarded trains for Tientsin. Disembarking from their trains, they were greeted by cheering crowds waving small American flags. It seemed that each one of Tientsin's 2 million people turned out for the parade, wrote an American correspondent. A few days after the Tangkou landings, a battalion of the 7th Marines came ashore at Chinwangdao, and on the 11th of October, the 6th Marine Division began unloading from transports in the harbor of Tsingtao. An American correspondent reported that Chinese restaurants had switched smoothly from serving shark's fin soup or 8 precious grains to offering steak with or without eggs. Tsingtao was crowded with thousands of refugees from the fighting in the countryside between the communists and nationalists, as well as renegade Chinese soldiers who had fought on the Japanese side. Rioting and looting had broken out in the Japanese and German sections of the city. Within a few days of their arrival, heavily armed squads of Marines were patrolling the streets of Tsingtao, bringing an end to the widespread unrest in the city. While the Marines were dealing with rioting, the mayor of Tsingtao was concerned with more pressing problems. He told his American liaison that he was worried about having enough cabarets, dancing girls, and prostitutes for the American forces. Cabarets were available, but there were no dancing girls in the city. The mayor tactfully suggested to his American liaison officer that the Americans import a boatload of dancing girls from Shanghai. Meanwhile, to meet the emergency, he had ordered an inventory of white Russian girls in Tsingtao. Well, what did the Marines think about China? During 2000-2001, I did a survey of Marines who had served in China using the roster provided to me by the China Marine Association. My research assistant and I took every 20th name in the roster and mailed them a questionnaire. We had a very good response, about 80%, and many of the observations I'm going to make are based on these questionnaires. Although Marines had heard a lot of stories about China, they were still unprepared for the new world that they encountered there. It was a mysterious country full of people and strange smells, recalled Corporal Jack McManus, especially for a young Marine who grew up in a village of 95 people. Corporal Edmund Barty, a machine gunner in the 5th Marines, succinctly expressed the reaction of many Marines: filth, poverty-stricken, unhealthy sanitary conditions, backward, plenty of history. Many found the smells and crowded conditions in the cities disconcerting, but what impressed the Americans most was the desperate poverty. We would have young children trying to sneak into our barracks to raid the garbage so they could get something to eat, recalled Sergeant Warren Beester. While they found these practices appalling or simply incomprehensible, most Marines recognized that the Chinese were engaged in a struggle for survival. many Marines used that term, a struggle for survival. Corporal Louis Weibel observed that Tsingtao had very proficient thieves, but that was due to their circumstances and their need to survive. The Marines' attitude toward Chinese civilians, although not always Chinese soldiers, was generally positive. In recalling their experiences decades later, the Americans used words such as friendly, hardworking, cooperative, polite, and efficient in describing their encounters with the Chinese. Very cooperative and pleasant. I never met an unfriendly person in my tour in China. They were delightful people, even with all their hardships. These were representative comments. Paul Nolan of the 1st Marines found most of the people quite warm and friendly. The soldiers were also pleasant. That is, until we met them again in Korea. There are, of course, good reasons not to take these statements at face value. Most, although by no means all, of the Chinese civilians that the Marines had any extended contact with were servants, girlfriends, shopkeepers, or prostitutes, for whom friendliness toward Americans was an essential survival trait. In addition, the Marines, like most of their contemporaries, tended to view China and the Chinese in ways that reflected common American racial stereotypes and categories. Donald C. Behrens of the 11th Marines recalled that Marines regularly used racial epithets in referring to the Chinese. A widespread view was that Chinese society was backward, centuries behind ours, and it had always been that way. Nevertheless, the generally positive feelings of the Marines toward China and the Chinese, which persisted even among Marines who later faced the Chinese armies in Korea, provide a significant contrast to the rancor, animosity, and contempt that GIs manifested toward Koreans and Vietnamese in later wars. This positive view helped to keep morale high, although all through the Marines' difficult 4-year stay in North China. Evidence is lacking about whether ordinary Chinese reciprocated the friendly feelings of the Marines, but there is good reason for doubt. Chinese students and intellectuals in Beijing resented the stationing of foreign troops in China's traditional center of learning. Students and other middle-class Chinese complained of numerous deaths and injuries due to traffic accidents involving American military vehicles. In China, the traditional rule was that fast-moving cars gave the right-of-way to slower-moving vehicles like rickshaws and carts. But nobody seems to have explained this to the Americans. Chinese intellectuals and members of the upper class believed that the Americans conducted themselves like barbarians because of the generally lower standard of civilization in the U.S. A notorious rape case involving 2 Marines and a woman student at Peking University at the end of 1946 brought out massive student protests all over China. Chinese newspaper polls in early 1947 revealed that all but 2,000 of the 19,000 respondents favored immediate withdrawal of U.S. troops from the country. Well, several days before the Marines arrived in China, a task force landed advanced elements of Lieutenant General John R. Hodge's 24th Corps in Korea. Like the Marines, the soldiers of 24th Corps had been expecting an early return to the U.S. now that the war was over. Instead, they got Korea. Marines had been in China for over 40 years, and even the newest Marine in Qingdao, Tianjin, or Peking had consumed an ample stew of fact, sea stories, and half-remembered history about China before he even embarked from Okinawa. There was nothing of the sort about Korea. No gossip, no rumors, no colorful or blood-curdling stories, nothing. Almost no one in the Army spoke Korean, except for a handful of Americans of Korean descent and sons of missionary families. Thousands of soldiers had been trained in Japanese at the U.S. Army Military Government School in Charlottesville, Virginia, but policy prohibited the study of Korean in Army schools. Just before embarking, the men of the occupation force had received a pamphlet called Pocket Guide to Korea, which advised soldiers, if there is one subject to avoid, it is politics. Just say you don't know anything about it, which is undoubtedly the truth. While many Koreans soon found the American presence in Korea tiresome, many Americans found Korea to be the farthest shore of nowhere. I thought at the time that Korea was hopeless as a society, recalled a former Army engineer officer. It was this curious mix of more or less 20th century and 15th century. You could smell it 40 miles at sea. The only fertilizer they had was human excrement. Honey wagons were all over the place. This was obviously a society totally alien to us young Americans. We had no comprehension of it. Koreans themselves were not overly friendly in the eyes of the Americans. They appeared to lack the obsequiousness and the good manners of the Japanese, or the jovial and accommodating approach of those Chinese long accustomed to dealing with foreigners. Instead, the Koreans appeared proud, stubborn, puritanical, and contentious. Americans invariably referred to the Koreans as gooks, a derisive term that GIs applied indiscriminately to Filipinos, Chinese, Japanese, and other Asians. A sociologist observed that American soldiers who did speak a little Korean always used the very familiar forms even to the most respectable old men. This, of course, was an insult. For those soldiers who lacked any knowledge of the language, the feeling was that if the Koreans didn't understand what was being said, the corrective was to shout louder. The Koreans reciprocated these feelings. 53% of Koreans polled by U.S. Army intelligence in early 1946 said they held an unfavorable impression of Americans. A poll several months later revealed that 49% of Koreans preferred even Japanese rule to that of the Americans. For the complex and delicate operations involved in rebuilding and reforming a foreign nation, Hodge had too few officers and enlisted men, and these were seldom of the highest quality. Living conditions ranged from austere to primitive. All latrines and showers had to be located outside the barracks, and the heating in many barracks was inadequate. Many items in Korea were in short supply. While GIs in China and Japan shopped for jewelry, custom-tailored clothes, jade, and silk, an inspection team found that as late as 1947, GIs in Korea were still short of shoe polish, flashlights, cookies, and mirrors. The shortage of light bulbs was so acute that in many units it is necessary to bring bulbs from the squad room to the mess hall during meal hours. One bright spot appeared to be the venereal disease rate, which was unusually low for troops stationed in Korea. One officer speculated that this may have been because newcomers to the area were told that Korean men would not tolerate having their females mess around with Americans and were likely to mutilate any soldier caught in the act. It seems doubtful that many GIs in Korea were cheered by the assurance of one member of MacArthur's staff that, after all, living conditions in Korea were still superior to those which existed in the combat zones during the war. They were unhappy with Korea, and they tended to take it out on the Koreans. Well, the last example that I have in the book of an occupation that's a great contrast to the one in Korea was the Australians in the eastern part of the Netherlands Indies, which they were supposed to occupy at the end of the war, where they'd been fighting in one part of that area, and they were supposed to receive the Japanese surrender there. Well, the Australian government recognized Dutch colonial rule and was perfectly willing to help the Dutch reestablish their control in Indonesia. And of course, this was a policy that wasn't very popular with the Indonesians. So one might have expected that there would have been attacks or other aggressive acts directed against the Australians by the Indonesians, but in fact there weren't. The occupation went very smoothly, and when the Australians left, the Indonesians gave them a farewell party. So how did that happen? Well, it wasn't because the Australians knew anything about Indonesia. They were even more ignorant of Indonesia than the Americans were of Korea. They also used racial epithets. They referred to all the locals as the boogs. And the Australians basically just wanted to get home, like the other occupation forces. Nevertheless, the occupation went very well. One reason was that unlike the Americans in Korea, the Australians were not isolated from the local population. The Australians who came to Indonesia had been subsisting on canned rations for almost a year, and they really were interested in obtaining fresh fruits and vegetables and meat that the local people had. On the other hand, the local people hadn't seen any canned goods in a long time, and so a very vigorous barter system soon grew up, and this involved constant contact, and also some of the Australians were actually invited to Indonesian homes to cook the stuff that they had bought from the Indonesians. But the most important factor was actually something that was going on in Australia, and that was a nationwide dock strike by the communist-led Longshoremen's Union against Dutch ships that were going to Indonesia. And this pretty much closed down any Dutch shipping from Australia. And Indonesians learned about the dock strike through radio broadcasts, and they assumed that this meant that the Australians were all on their side. And so they were very, very grateful for this strike and very, very friendly towards the Australians. They also noticed that the Australians didn't like the Dutch very much, which was true. So they drew the obvious conclusion: the Australians are really on our side. So through this series of fortunate coincidences, they had probably the smoothest occupation. So I think I'll end there, but just one general comment, which is that the most deleterious effects of these Allied military presence developed not through blunders or misjudgments of people carrying out the occupations, but they occurred when the highest levels of government acted indecisively, had mistaken notions or no notions at all about what was actually happening on the scene, and neglected reports and recommendations from the field. It remains to be seen whether these patterns of behavior will be repeated in Iraq and Afghanistan. If they are, then the experiences of 50 years ago suggest what consequences we can expect. So I think I've run through more than my time, so I'll stop here and try to answer any questions you may have. Yes. Well, no, they weren't fighting for Japan. There was a small number of them in Southeast Asia. A few of them, like the guy who was in the news about 15 years ago, basically were just sort of holding out and fighting off starvation and trying to remain concealed. But most of the Japanese who stayed behind in Southeast Asia were recruited or forced to join the nationalists in these various countries. They were often paid very well. Many of them had married local women, so they stayed on and contributed to the revolution. And the Indonesians, for instance, who didn't have a very happy time during the Japanese occupation, thousands of them died as a result of Japanese occupation policies and starvation. Nevertheless, the Indonesians remember the few hundred Japanese who stayed on after the end of the war to fight for independence, and they still are in contact with them. They have a kind of alumni association in Japan. Similarly, in Indochina, several dozen Japanese worked with the Viet Minh to train them on Japanese weapons, and sometimes they even led some Viet Minh units. In China, they were definitely they were recruited as whole units, and they basically had no say in whether they're going to stay or not. Yes.
How do you account for the success of the American occupation of Japan after the war?
I explained that in the book. Well, the main thing is, the other thing I didn't mention is that a big factor in a relative success of these occupations is if you have a powerful local faction that sees their fortunes enhanced by having the occupation, having the occupiers there. This happened with the Viet Minh in North China, where they made a deal with the Chinese. It happened in North Korea, where the Korean communists were very happy to have the Soviets there, and the Soviets brought their own Korean communists, that is, Soviet Koreans who'd been living in Russia, so that where there was a kind of perception of mutual interest, then you had the basis for cooperation and a relatively smooth occupation. Yes.
You get into your book. You get into what happened with some of the Japanese allies, such as Chandra Bose's army.
No, I don't. I don't talk about Bose, but Bose died at the very end of the war. The big thing that happened during the occupations was the trial, the apprehension and trial of many former members of Bose's Indian National Army. And that went on in Malaya to a great extent. And many of those people were sent back to India to stand trial, and that led to many popular demonstrations and lots of controversy. But that was in India, so I left that one alone. But there were, I know, in Singapore has the best personal records about the occupation because they have a big oral history project called Singapore under the Japanese occupation, where they interviewed about 300 people about their experiences during the occupation. A lot of them talk about the INA members who belonged to the Indian National Army. Yes?
We usually bring up the topic about the atomic bombs dropping to end the war. Well, from your talk, it sounds like, it wasn't just Japan who would have had to been fighting in for probably maybe some years, but also in China.
Yeah, Secretary Stimson raised that point in his meeting after the initial surrender offer was received from the Japanese. The Japanese said, well, we're going to surrender, but we understand that this is not going to mean the end of the empire, the end of the emperor. And so the question was how to respond to that. Most people didn't want to keep the emperor. But on the other hand, if the Allies turned down the surrender offer, there would be more fighting. So, and Stimson very strongly said we should keep the emperor because that's the only way we're going to maintain the obedience of these armies in places like Malaya and Indonesia and Korea. They haven't even fought yet. How are you going to get them to lay down their arms? The only way is if the emperor tells them to. So there was that argument. That argument was considered when they talked about the Japanese surrender.
How would you assess the role of General MacArthur as the head of the occupation army?
Well, he was in Japan. In his area of responsibility included Korea as well as Japan, but he didn't really pay any attention to Korea. He basically concentrated on Japan, which was a big enough task. And he, of course, was relatively successful in many of his reforms in Japan. And, of course, they ended up with a very American-oriented Japan, which was quite a trick. Yes?
I was wondering if your studies of Japan lead you to any conclusions about the ideas now that the Japan is rearming and the wisdom of that policy in terms of any ideas you might have?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of Japanese that don't want to see this rearmament, so we have to see how that plays out. Of course, it's recent events with North Korea that are the Japanese have been talking about disregarding, or amending the Constitution so that they can send troops overseas. But they've been talking about that for 10 or 15 years, but the real spur to this is the recent actions of North Korea. Yes?
You mentioned the Marines in northern China, late 45, 1946. When did they leave?
They didn't leave till 1949, although it was a far smaller number of Marines. They were basically, in 1949, all they were doing was guarding the naval base at Tsingtao.
Was that about the time Mao basically had changed lead?
Had what?
Was that about the time that Mao basically won that war to take back?
Yeah, that's that, and they never. The Marines and there were some clashes between Marines and the Chinese communists, but even when the communists had completely won the war, they never tried to get the Marines out. That is, they never attacked the Marines directly, and the Marines just left. Okay. Yes.
I don't think you mentioned Thailand.
Yeah.
Was Thailand also occupied by the Japanese?
Thailand became a puppet state of the Japanese, and they did station a lot of troops there. And the Thai government became a puppet government. However, there was a Thai government in exile. It's the only country in Asia that you had that set up. And there was a Free Thai movement, it was called, that is an underground, a guerrilla movement or an insurgency against the Thais. So at the end of the war, the question arose as to, well, is Thailand the former Japanese ally, or is Thailand secretly an ally of the United States? And the British said we should treat them as a former Axis partner, and the Americans said, no, they have the Free Thai movement, and basically they were on our side. There was a lot of arguing about how Thailand should be treated at the end of the war.